They laughed because she did not speak, but silence is often the loudest form of defiance. The grand hall shimmered beneath chandeliers of gold, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and jeweled gowns that whispered with every calculated step. Yet in the center of it all stood Elena Whitmore, still as winter, her hands folded gently before her, her chin neither raised in pride nor lowered in shame, simply steady, as if the storm around her belonged to another world entirely. The court had gathered not for celebration but for spectacle, and tonight, she was the spectacle. "Is it true?" A woman's voice rang out, silk-wrapped and sharp. "She cannot speak a single word." Laughter followed, light at first, then swelling, echoing against the high vaulted ceilings until it seemed the very walls joined in the mockery. Elena did not move, though the sound pressed against her like a rising tide. She felt it in the air, in the vibration of the floor beneath her shoes, in the way eyes lingered too long, searching for weakness, for collapse. "Perhaps she does not understand us," a gentleman added with a careless shrug. "Or perhaps she has nothing worth saying." More? Laughter, louder now, crueler, like a chorus rehearsed for this very moment. At the edge of the room, servants kept their gazes lowered, though even they could not escape the tension curling through the space like smoke. Elena's fingers tightened just slightly, the smallest movement, easily missed, but it was there, the only sign that she was not carved from stone. The orchestra faltered for a breath, then resumed, as if even the music hesitated before continuing its duty. "Speak," another voice demanded, stepping closer into her space, too close. "Surely even you can manage a single word." The challenge hung between them, heavy, expectant, the room leaning in as one, waiting for her to fail them, or perhaps to amuse them further. Elena's gaze lifted, not to the man before her, but beyond him, as if searching for something no one else could see. Her lips parted slightly, just enough to suggest a response, and the entire court held its breath, but no sound came, only silence, deep and unwavering. And somehow, that silence unsettled them more than any answer could have. Whispers flickered at the edges, uncertainty threading through the laughter, thin and fragile. "Pathetic," someone muttered, though. The word lacked its earlier confidence, and then, from the shadows near the far column, where candlelight dared not fully reach, a figure shifted, unnoticed by most, but not by her, because in that instant, Elena's stillness changed, not broken, but sharpened, as though something unseen had finally stepped into place, and though no one yet understood it. The balance of the room had already begun to tilt. The shift was so subtle that no one could name it, yet everyone felt it, like the air before. A storm breaks across an open field. The laughter did not stop at once, but it lost its rhythm, its certainty, turning uneven, forced, a performance no longer shared by all. The nobleman standing closest to Elena cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control. "You see," he said louder than necessary, "she proves my point." But even as he spoke, his voice did not carry the same effortless cruelty. It wavered, just slightly, as though something unseen had pressed against it. Elena remained where she stood, her posture unchanged. Yet there was a quiet gravity to her now, something that drew the eye rather than invited ridicule, as if the silence they had mocked had become something else entirely, something deliberate, something chosen. At the far end of the hall, a pair of doors stood open to the cold night, and a faint draft slipped through, brushing against the candle flames, causing them to tremble in uneven patterns across the room. Shadows stretched longer, deeper, swallowing corners that had moments ago been bright with spectacle. "Enough of this," another voice interjected, sharper, impatient. A woman adorned in diamonds stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Elena with thinly veiled disdain. "If she cannot speak, then she should not stand among those who can." A murmur of agreement followed, softer now, cautious, as though each person waited to see who would speak next before committing themselves fully. Elena's eyes shifted then, not toward the woman, but again, toward that same distant point in the room, the place where shadow met stone, where something unseen had begun to take shape. Her breath remained steady, slow, measured, as if the weight of the room had no claim over her, and that alone unsettled them more than defiance ever could. The nobleman reached out slightly, not touching her, but close enough to suggest he might. "You waste our time," he said, though the edge of command had dulled into irritation, into something almost defensive. The orchestra faltered once more, this time longer, the musicians exchanging brief glances before continuing with hesitant strokes. And in that hesitation, the silence deepened, no longer hers alone, but spreading, claiming space, pressing into the spaces between every whispered word, every shifting footstep, until it became impossible to ignore. And then, a single movement broke through it. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. From the shadows, the figure stepped forward at last, not hurried, not announced, but with the kind of presence that did not require either. Boots against marble, measured and steady, each step echoing just enough to draw attention without demanding it. Heads began to turn, one by one, the ripple of awareness moving through the court like a current. And though no name had yet been spoken, though no declaration had yet been made, something fundamental had already changed, because for the first time that evening, Elena Whitmore was no longer the only one standing in silence. The sound of his footsteps did not rush, did not echo loudly, yet each one seemed to land with a quiet certainty that drew the entire room toward him. Conversations faded not because they were ordered to stop, but because no one could continue speaking while he moved. Duke Alexander Blackwood stepped fully into the light, his presence neither dramatic nor forced, but undeniable, like a shadow finally given form. His dark coat caught the candlelight in sharp edges, his gaze steady, unreadable, sweeping once across the gathered court before settling, without hesitation, on her. Elena did not lower her eyes, did not shift her stance, yet something within her stilled even further, as if the world had narrowed to the space between them. The nobleman nearest her straightened abruptly, his earlier confidence dissolving into a stiff formality. "Your Grace," he said, offering a shallow bow that came a fraction too late. The woman in diamonds followed, her smile returning but thinner now, carefully measured. "We were merely entertaining ourselves," she added, her voice softer, as though the word entertainment might disguise what had truly taken place. Alexander did not respond immediately. Silence stretched again, but this time it did not belong to Elena, it belonged to him, and no one dared to break it. He took another step forward, closing the distance not with urgency, but with intention, stopping just within reach of her. Though he did not touch her, his eyes did not leave hers, not even for a moment, as if the entire court had become irrelevant in the presence of something far more precise, far more personal. The nobleman attempted a laugh, brief and hollow. "We meant no offense, of course, merely a harmless curiosity." But the words fell flat, unnoticed, because Alexander had already made his decision long before he entered the light. And then, with a voice that did not rise yet carried through every corner of the hall, he spoke. "Elena Whitmore." The name did not sound like an introduction, nor a question. It sounded like recognition, like something that had always existed and simply needed to be acknowledged. The effect was immediate. The last fragments of laughter vanished, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt almost physical. Elena's breath caught, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that the moment shifted again. Her name, spoken clearly, without hesitation, without doubt. The court reacted in whispers, sharp, confused, uncertain, glances exchanged, calculations made, because a name spoken by a man like him was never just a name. It was a statement, a position, a line drawn in a place where lines were rarely crossed without consequence. The woman in diamonds faltered first. "Your Grace, surely you do not mean to suggest," she began. But her voice trailed as his gaze flickered briefly toward her, not with anger, not even with disapproval, but with something colder, something final. And in that single glance, her words lost their footing entirely. The nobleman stepped back half an inch, barely noticeable, yet enough to reveal the shift that had already taken hold. The room was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the moment now, to the weight of a name spoken at precisely the right time. And for the first time that evening, the court was not watching Elena to see her fail. They were watching her. Because someone far more powerful had chosen to see her first, no one moved at first, as if the entire court had forgotten how. The weight of that single moment settling into every corner of the hall, pressing against polished marble and jeweled silence alike. Elena Whitmore stood exactly where she had been, yet nothing about her presence felt the same, because now she was no longer unseen, no longer dismissed as a quiet inconvenience to be tolerated or mocked. She had been named, and in this world, to be named by a man like him was to be claimed by recognition itself. The nobleman who had stood closest to her took another small step back, this time impossible to ignore, his earlier confidence unraveling thread by thread. "Your Grace," he began again, more cautiously now. "Surely this is a misunderstanding." But even as he spoke, his gaze avoided Elena entirely, as though looking at her directly might confirm something he was not ready to accept. The woman in diamonds lifted her chin, attempting to recover what dignity she could salvage. "We meant no disrespect," she said, though the words felt hollow even as they left her lips. Because the room had already shifted beyond their control, Alexander did not raise his voice, did not gesture, did not need to. His presence alone held the space with quiet authority. His eyes remained on Elena, unwavering, as if the rest of the court existed only as distant noise. "There was no misunderstanding," he said at last, his tone calm, measured, yet carrying a finality that silenced any thought of argument. The words were simple, but in them lay something far more powerful than defense. They did not excuse her, did not explain her. They simply placed her beyond the reach of their judgment. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, because if she was beyond judgment, then what did that make them? Elena felt it, the shift not just in the room, but in the way the air itself seemed to breathe differently. She had stood in silence before, had endured whispers and glances and quiet exclusions, but this was something else entirely. This was not survival. This was transformation. Her hands, still folded, relaxed just slightly, the tension easing in a way so small it would go unnoticed by most. But not by him, never by him. Alexander took one final step closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough that the separation between them no longer felt like a divide. The court watched, every eye fixed on the space between them, waiting, calculating, uncertain of what would follow, because whatever came next would not be a return to what had been. It would be something new, something irreversible. The nobleman lowered his gaze at last, the first clear sign of surrender, and with that single motion, the unspoken hierarchy of the room fractured, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, undeniable way that could never be undone. Elena lifted her eyes fully to meet Alexander's, not in defiance, not in gratitude, but in recognition, as if she understood something that the rest of them did not, something that had existed long before this moment and would remain long after it. And though no one could yet name it, the truth lingered in the silence between them, steady, unyielding, waiting to be revealed. The silence between them did not break. It deepened, stretching into something that no one in the room could quite understand, yet all could feel, like standing at the edge of something vast and unseen. Elena Whitmore held his gaze, not with boldness, not with submission, but with a quiet steadiness that seemed to reflect something back at him, something that had been missing long before she ever stepped into this hall. The court shifted uneasily, the weight of their earlier laughter now settling into something heavier, something closer to shame, though none would dare name it aloud. The woman in diamonds adjusted her gloves, the faint rustle of fabric louder than it should have been in the charged stillness. "Your Grace," she tried once more, softer now, careful. "Perhaps we have misjudged the situation." But the words lacked conviction, because misjudgment implied ignorance, and what had occurred felt far too deliberate for that. Alexander did not turn toward her, did not acknowledge the attempt to reclaim control. His attention remained fixed on Elena, as though the rest of the room had faded into irrelevance. "You have judged enough," he said quietly, and though the words were not raised, they carried with them a boundary that no one dared cross again. A subtle shift rippled outward, the court retreating not in movement, but in presence. Conversations stilled, postures softened, eyes lowered, as if an invisible line had been drawn, and they had all stepped back from it without realizing. Elena's breath moved slowly, steady as before, yet something within her had changed, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had seen, because for the first time, her silence was not something to endure, but something to be understood. Her fingers loosened completely now, the tension gone. replaced by a calm that did not come from relief, but from certainty. Alexander studied her for a moment longer, as if confirming something only he could recognize. Then, with the smallest inclination of his head, he acknowledged her, not as a curiosity, not as a burden, but as an equal presence in the space they now shared. The gesture was subtle, easily missed by most, but its meaning settled deeply into the room, because men like him did not offer acknowledgement lightly, and certainly not to someone the court had just dismissed. A murmur rose again, quieter this time, uncertain. The nobleman who had first spoken against her shifted his weight, his confidence now entirely absent. "We did not realize," he began, but stopped, because there was nothing he could say that would restore what had already been undone. Elena did not look at him, did not grant him the recognition he had once demanded from her. Instead, her attention remained where it had always been, steady, deliberate, and now, undeniably seen. The chandeliers above flickered softly as the draft moved once more through the hall, the light catching in her hair, in the curve of her stillness, transforming what had once been overlooked into something impossible to ignore. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the court understood something without being told. That whatever Elena Whitmore had been before this night no longer mattered, because she was no longer defined by their silence around her, but by the one man who had chosen to break it in a way none of them could undo for a moment. No one dared to move, as if the entire court had been suspended in the fragile space between what had been and what was becoming. The music had stopped entirely now, though no one could recall exactly when, leaving only the faint crackle of candle flames and the distant whisper of wind slipping through the open doors. Elena Whitmore stood within that stillness, no longer surrounded, no longer cornered, but centered, as if the room itself had rearranged around her presence. Duke Alexander Blackwood did not step away, nor did he close the distance further. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, creating a quiet equilibrium between them that no one else could enter. His gaze softened, not visibly, not in any way the court would recognize, but enough that something unspoken passed between them, something that did not require words, and perhaps could not be carried by them even if spoken. The noblewoman who had once led the mockery lowered her eyes completely now, her composure fractured beyond repair, her silence no longer chosen but forced, a mirror of what she had once tried to impose on another. "We were unaware," she said at last, her voice barely above a breath, though whether she spoke to him or to the room itself was unclear. Alexander did not answer her, because the moment no longer belonged to explanation or apology, it belonged to truth, and truth did not require permission to exist. Elena felt the weight of that truth settle within her, not as something new, but as something long carried finally brought into the light. Her silence had never been emptiness. It had never been weakness. It had been a boundary, a protection, a choice shaped by things the court could not see and had never cared to understand. And now, standing here, she realized that it had also been a test, one she had endured without knowing who, if anyone, would ever see beyond it. Alexander's voice came again, low, measured, yet carrying a quiet authority that reshaped the air itself. "There is a difference," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "between those who cannot speak and those who choose when to." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that rippled through the room, forcing every listener to reconsider what they had assumed, what they had judged, what they had dismissed. A murmur rose again, softer still, uncertain, because this was no longer about her silence. It was about their blindness. Elena's breath steadied further, her posture unchanged, yet there was something new in the way she held herself. Not pride, not defiance, but clarity, as if the invisible weight she had carried for so long had shifted into something else, something that no longer pressed her down but anchored her in place. The nobleman who had once demanded she speak now avoided her entirely. His earlier presence diminished into something almost forgettable, and in that quiet reversal, the truth became undeniable. The power in the room had changed hands without a single raised voice, without a single argument, without anything but recognition. Alexander finally turned his gaze outward, just briefly, not to address the court, but to acknowledge its existence once more. And in that fleeting glance, the unspoken message was clear. This moment was not theirs to question, not theirs to reshape. It had already been decided. Elena followed that shift only slightly, her eyes moving just enough to take in the room that had once closed in around her. And for the first time, it did not feel like a place of judgment, but a place of witness. And though she still had not spoken a single word, the silence she held now felt entirely different. No longer something they could use against her, but something that belonged wholly, unmistakably. To her alone. The court did not recover all at once. It never truly does when something fundamental has shifted beneath its feet. Instead, it adjusted slowly, like a grand structure settling after a quiet fracture. Conversations did not resume so much as cautiously return. Voices lowered, measured, each word chosen with care, as if the wrong tone might unravel what little composure remained. Elena Whitmore stood within it all, unchanged in posture, yet transformed in presence. No longer the center of mockery, but the axis around which the room now turned. Duke Alexander Blackwood remained beside her, not claiming space, not demanding attention, yet commanding both with an ease that required no effort. His silence now matched hers, but where hers had once been questioned, his was accepted without hesitation, and that contrast alone spoke louder than any declaration. A servant passed quietly along the edge of the hall, carrying a silver tray that trembled ever so slightly in his hands. The smallest detail, yet it revealed what the court would not admit. They were unsettled, deeply so. The noblewoman in diamonds withdrew a step further into the crowd, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful distance, her eyes no longer daring to meet Elena's. As if recognition itself had become something dangerous, the nobleman who had first spoken stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture meant to suggest dignity. Yet his gaze remained fixed somewhere just past Elena's shoulder, unwilling to confront what had already been revealed. And in that avoidance, his earlier authority dissolved entirely. Elena became aware of the space around her in a new way, not as pressure, not as scrutiny, but as something that parted for her. Without resistance, the invisible boundaries that had once closed and now opened, subtle but undeniable, as though the room itself acknowledged her presence differently. She took a single step forward, not away from Alexander, not toward the court, but simply forward, and that one step carried a quiet certainty that echoed far beyond the sound it made. No one stopped her, no one challenged her, because there was nothing left to challenge. The transformation had already occurred. Alexander's gaze followed her movement, not controlling, not guiding, but witnessing. And in that witnessing was a kind of respect the court could neither imitate nor ignore. The orchestra, uncertain at first, began to play again, soft notes rising carefully into the air, testing whether the moment had truly passed. Yet even the music carried a different tone now, less ornamental, more aware, as if it too understood that something within the hall had changed in a way that could not be undone. Elena paused near the center once more, her eyes lifting slightly as she took in the room that had once seemed so vast, so overwhelming, and now felt contained, not smaller, but clearer, as if its true shape had finally revealed itself. She did not speak, did not need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been placed into the silence she carried. And for the first time, that silence was not something others tried to fill or break. It was something they respected, even if they did not yet understand why. And behind her, just a step away yet unmistakably present, Duke Alexander Blackwood remained, not as a shield, not as a savior, but as a man who had recognized something the rest of them had missed, and in doing so, had changed the balance of an entire world without raising his voice at all. The music continued, but no one truly listened, not in the way they had before. It filled the space like a memory rather than a presence, something familiar yet distant, unable to reclaim what had already shifted beyond its reach. Elena Whitmore stood where she had paused, her breath steady, her gaze calm, and for the first time since entering the hall, she allowed herself to look fully, not at the people who had once surrounded her, but at the space itself, the towering columns, the flickering chandeliers, the polished marble that reflected fragments of movement and light. It all seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The court remained careful. Conversations resumed in fragments, voices lowered, gestures restrained, as though every movement now carried weight. as though each person was aware that something unseen lingered between them all, watching, measuring, remembering. The noblewoman in diamonds turned away entirely, retreating into a cluster of whispered alliances, her laughter gone, replaced by a quiet calculation that no longer held certainty. The nobleman who had first challenged Elena found himself speaking to no one in particular, his words falling into empty space, because the audience he once commanded had shifted its attention elsewhere, towards something far more compelling, toward a silence that had revealed itself as strength rather than absence. Duke Alexander Blackwood remained where he was, his presence steady, unyielding, not dominating the room, but anchoring it. His gaze moved briefly across the court now, not in judgment, not in warning, but in acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement carried more weight than any spoken command. It reminded them that this moment had not been an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate recognition that could not be undone. Elena felt it in the subtle changes around her, the way space opened before her without resistance, the way glances shifted from curiosity to caution, from dismissal to something closer to respect. She had not spoken, yet she had been heard more clearly than anyone else in the room, and that realization settled within her like a quiet flame, steady, unwavering. She took another step, slow, deliberate, not seeking permission, not seeking escape, but simply moving forward as she had always intended to. And once again, no one stopped her, no one questioned her, because there was nothing left to question. The truth had already been revealed. Alexander's attention returned to her, not following, not leading, but present, always present, as though he understood that what mattered now was not what he had done, but what she would choose next. The distance between them remained unchanged, yet it no longer felt like separation. It felt like space given, space respected. The orchestra swelled slightly, testing its place in the new rhythm of the room, and though the music grew stronger, it never quite overshadowed the quiet certainty that had taken hold. Elena reached the far side of the hall where the open doors allowed the night air to slip inside, cool and steady, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant earth. She paused there, just at the threshold, the candlelight behind her casting a soft glow around her figure, and for a moment, she stood between two worlds, the one that had tried to define her and the one that had yet to be revealed. She did not turn back, did not seek confirmation, because she no longer needed it. And behind her, within the golden hall that had once echoed with laughter, Duke Alexander Blackwood remained, his presence unchanged, yet his silence now carried a question the court could not hear. Only she could, a question not of who she was, but of what she would become next. The night air brushed softly against Elena Whitmore's face, cool and steady, carrying with it a quiet that felt different from the silence she had known inside. This silence did not press, did not demand. It simply existed, open and unclaimed. She stood at the threshold. For a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the carved wooden doorframe, feeling the faint chill of the stone beneath her fingertips. Behind her, the music swelled and softened again, uncertain, as though the hall itself had not yet decided what it wished to become after what had just unfolded. She did not turn, yet she was aware of everything. The shifting weight of footsteps, the cautious return of voices, the subtle distance that now separated her from those who had once stood too close. And somewhere within that awareness, there was him, steady, unmistakable, not approaching, not retreating, simply there, as constant as the silence she carried. Elena stepped forward into the night, her shoes meeting the cold stone terrace with a sound that felt clearer than anything she had heard inside. The sky stretched wide above her, dark and endless, scattered with faint stars that seemed distant yet unwavering. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe fully, deeply, as if the air itself belonged to her now in a way it had not before. The weight she had carried for so long did not disappear, but it shifted, settling into something she could hold without being burdened by it, a quiet strength that did not need to be proven, only lived. The doors behind her remained open, and from within, a presence followed, not immediately, not with urgency, but with the same measured certainty that had altered everything before. Duke Alexander Blackwood stepped onto the terrace, the transition from candlelight to night casting his figure in softer contrast. less defined by shadow, more by stillness. He did not speak, not at first, and neither did she. Because whatever existed between them did not require interruption. It unfolded in the space they shared, in the distance that remained, in the understanding that neither rushed to claim nor deny. Elena turned slightly then, just enough to meet his gaze, and in that moment, there was no court, no whispers, no expectations pressing in from unseen corners. There was only the quiet recognition that had begun long before he spoke her name, something that had been waiting, patient, unseen, until the right moment revealed it. His expression did not change, yet there was something there, something unguarded beneath the restraint, a question perhaps, or a certainty not yet spoken aloud. "You chose silence," he said at last, his voice low, steady, carrying no judgment, only acknowledgement. Elena held his gaze, and for the first time, there was the slightest shift in her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something softer, something real, and when she answered, her voice was quiet, clear, as though it had never been absent at all. "No," she said, the words simple, unadorned, yet carrying more weight than anything spoken within the hall. "I chose when to be heard." The night seemed to still around them, the air holding that truth as something fragile and unbreakable all at once. And in that moment, it became clear that what had begun inside the Golden Hall was not an ending, not even a victory, but the first step into something far greater, something neither of them could yet fully see, but both, in their own way, had already chosen to face. The words lingered between them long after she spoke. Them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like something that had always been true and simply waited for the right moment to exist in the open. Duke Alexander Blackwood did not respond immediately, and in that pause there was no hesitation, only recognition, as if her answer had confirmed something he had already known but had chosen to wait for. The night stretched quietly around them, the faint glow of candlelight spilling from the open doors behind, blending with the cool darkness of the terrace, creating a space that felt suspended between two worlds. Elena Whitmore stood within that space, no longer caught between them, but standing firmly in her own. Her voice, now spoken, did not break the silence she carried. It deepened it, gave it shape, made it something that could no longer be misunderstood or dismissed. Alexander's gaze remained steady on her, but there was a shift now, subtle, yet unmistakable, the kind of shift that comes when something guarded begins to open, not fully, not yet, but enough to be felt. "Then they never had the right to question you," he said quietly, the words simple, but carrying a quiet gravity that extended beyond the moment itself, because it was not just a statement, it was a correction, a quiet undoing of everything the court had assumed. Elena held his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was something like reflection in her eyes, not of him, but of something deeper, something that existed beneath both of them, something shaped by experience, by restraint, by choices made long before this night. They questioned what they could not understand. She replied, her voice calm, even, not defensive, not bitter, but certain, and in that certainty, there was no need for further explanation. The air shifted slightly as a breeze moved across the terrace, brushing past them, carrying with it the distant sound of the orchestra, attempting once more to reclaim its place within the hall. Yet even that sound felt changed, as though it too had been altered by what had occurred. Alexander's attention moved briefly beyond her, not in distraction, but in awareness, acknowledging the world that still existed beyond this moment, then returned to her, as if choosing, deliberately, where his focus belonged. "You could have spoken sooner," he said, not as an accusation, but as a question that did not fully ask itself. Elena's expression softened again, just slightly, the smallest shift that carried more meaning than any outward display. "And said what?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet carrying a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. "That they would not hear." The words settled between them, not heavy, but grounded, as if they belonged there, as if they had always belonged there. And in that realization, something within Alexander shifted. Again, deeper this time, less guarded, less distant, because he understood now, not just what she had done, but why. And that understanding carried a weight that did not need to be spoken aloud. The distance between them remained, yet it no longer felt like separation. It felt like choice, deliberate and mutual, the kind of distance that does not divide, but defines. Behind them, the doors remained open, the golden light still spilling outward, but neither of them moved toward it, not yet. Because what existed here, in this quiet space between the world that had judged her and the world that had yet to see her, was something that could not be rushed, could not be interrupted. And as the night continued to settle around them, it became clear that what had begun as a moment of recognition had become something far more lasting, something that would not end when they stepped back inside, but would follow them, shaping everything that came next, whether they chose it or not. The night did not press them forward. It allowed them to remain, suspended in a space where time seemed less urgent, less demanding, as though the world beyond the terrace had paused just long enough for something quieter, something more deliberate to take shape. Elena Whitmore stood with that same steady composure. Yet there was a new awareness in her posture, not of the court behind her, but of the man before her, because for the first time, she was not being watched in silence. She was being understood within it. Duke Alexander Blackwood shifted slightly, not closer, not farther, but enough to break the perfect stillness between them, his hand moving to rest lightly against the stone railing beside him. The gesture unremarkable to any observer, yet deliberate, grounding, as though even he recognized that this moment required something different than command or control. "You knew they would turn on you," he said after a pause, his voice low, thoughtful, not questioning her choice, but acknowledging the weight of it. Elena's gaze drifted briefly toward the horizon beyond the terrace, where darkness met distance in a seamless line. "They always do," she answered, her tone calm, not resigned, but certain, as if the truth of it no longer carried any surprise. The faintest trace of something passed through Alexander's expression then, not sympathy, not quite, but something close to it, something that suggested he understood more than he revealed. The wind shifted again, lifting a loose strand of her hair before letting it fall back into place, a small, fleeting motion that seemed to echo the quiet tension between them. "And yet you stayed," he continued, not as a challenge, but as an observation that carried its own weight. Elena's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer, more reflective. Leaving would have given them the answer they expected, she said, her eyes returning to his, steady, unwavering. "I chose not to be predictable." The words settled into the space between them, not sharp, not defensive, but precise, and in that precision, there was a kind of strength that did not need to be proven. Alexander regarded her for a long moment, as if measuring something beyond her words, beyond her silence, something that could not be easily defined. And then, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head again, not as a formal gesture, not as an obligation, but as a recognition of something rare, something he did not often encounter. "You changed the room," he said quietly, the statement simple, yet carrying a weight that extended beyond the walls of the hall behind them. Elena did not respond immediately, because she knew that what had changed was not the room itself, but the way it had chosen to see her, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. "No," she said at last, her voice even, grounded. "I let them see what was already there." The truth of it settled between them, steady and undeniable, and in that moment, something shifted again, not in the court, not in the world beyond the terrace, but in the space they shared, a quiet alignment, unspoken yet unmistakable, because neither of them had tried to claim the moment, neither had tried to control it, they had simply recognized it, and that recognition had created something neither of them could have forced. Behind them, the music continued, the court slowly returning to its patterns, its rituals, its carefully constructed order. But here, on the edge of that world, something else had taken root, something quieter, deeper, something that would not fade when the candles burned low or the doors finally closed. And as Elena Whitmore stood beneath the open sky, facing a man who had seen her not as she appeared, but as she was, it became clear that whatever came next would not be shaped by the court's expectations, but by the choices they had both already begun to make. The night had deepened, the air growing cooler as the last traces of warmth from the hall faded into the distance. Yet neither Elena Whitmore nor Duke Alexander Blackwood moved to return. as if both understood that stepping back inside would mean re-entering a world that no longer held the same power over them. The terrace remained quiet, untouched by the shifting dynamics within, a place suspended between what had been and what would come next. Elena's gaze lifted once more to the horizon, her expression calm. Yet there was something new beneath it, something that had not been there before this night. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, but possibility, and that possibility carried with it a quiet weight, because it was not something given. It was something chosen. Alexander watched her, not with the distant assessment he had once carried, but with a focus that had grown sharper, more intentional, as though he had begun to understand that what stood before him was not simply a woman who had endured silence, but one who had shaped it into something far more powerful. "The court will not forget this," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not as a warning, but as a recognition of the world they would inevitably return to. Elena did not look away from the horizon, her voice calm as she answered. "They will remember what they need to." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, as if she had already accepted the limits of what others could see. The wind moved again, carrying with it the faint sound of distant laughter from within the hall, softer now, restrained, as though even those who tried to return to normalcy could not fully escape what had been revealed. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly toward the open doors, then back to her. "And what do you need them to see?" he asked. The question quiet, yet deliberate, not about the court, but about her. Elena turned then, fully this time, facing him without hesitation, her eyes steady, her presence grounded in something that no longer required defense. "Nothing," she said simply, and in that single word was a truth that carried more weight than any declaration, because it meant she was no longer defined by their perception, no longer shaped by their approval or their doubt. She existed beyond it, entirely. Alexander studied her, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but filled with understanding, and in that understanding, something shifted again, deeper than before, something that moved beyond recognition into choice. "Then you are free of them," he said quietly, not as a statement to be proven, but as a truth already realized. Elena held his gaze, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something warmer in her expression, not a smile, but something close to it, something that acknowledged the weight of what he had said without diminishing its significance. "I always was," she replied, her voice soft, yet unwavering, and in that moment, the final thread that had once tied her to the expectations of the court seemed to dissolve completely, leaving behind something far more enduring, something that belonged only to her. The night seemed to settle around them in quiet agreement, the world beyond the terrace continuing as it always had, yet altered in a way that could not be undone, because what had changed was not the court, not the hall, not even the balance of power within it. What had changed was the way she stood within it, and that was something no one could take from her again. Alexander remained where he was, not stepping closer, not retreating, but present, steady, as if he understood that whatever came next would not be dictated by him, nor by the court, but by the choices she had already begun to make. And as the candlelight flickered behind them and the night stretched endlessly ahead, it became clear that this moment was not an ending, but a threshold, one that neither of them would cross unchanged. The silence did not end. It transformed, stretching beyond the terrace, beyond the night, into something that neither Elena Whitmore nor Duke Alexander Blackwood needed to name, because it had already defined itself in the choices they had made. The wind moved softly around them, no longer cold, no longer distant, but steady, grounding, as if the world itself had settled into a new balance that did not require acknowledgement. Elena stood with a calm that was no longer shaped by resistance, no longer sharpened by survival, but rooted in something far more enduring, something that could not be shaken by laughter or lifted by praise. It simply was. Alexander watched her for a moment longer, not searching, not questioning, but seeing, truly seeing, and in that quiet recognition, there was no need for further words, because everything that had needed to be spoken had already been said in the spaces between them. The doors behind them remained open, the golden light still spilling outward, yet it no longer called to her, no longer held any claim over where she stood or where she might go next. The court inside would continue, as it always had, adjusting its stories, reshaping its narratives, convincing itself that it understood what had happened, even when it did not. But none of that reached her now. None of it defined her. She stepped forward, not back toward the hall, but along the terrace, her movement unhurried, certain, the sound of her footsteps soft against the stone, yet clear, as if each step marked something final and something beginning all at once. Alexander did not follow immediately. He remained where he was for a brief moment, watching, not to ensure her direction, not to guide her path, but to acknowledge it. And then, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him into the hall, he moved, not ahead of her, not behind her, but beside her, the distance between them measured, deliberate, a space that belonged to both of them without needing to be filled. They walked without speaking, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer waiting to be broken, but alive in its own way, carrying everything that words could not hold. The night stretched before them, wide and unclaimed, and for the first time, it did not feel like something to endure, but something to step into, something to choose. Elena's gaze remained forward, steady, not looking back, because there was nothing behind her that required it. Nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved. What had needed to end had ended, and what had needed to begin had already taken its first breath. Alexander's presence beside her remained constant, not pressing, not demanding, but present in a way that did not confine, only accompanied. And in that quiet companionship, there was something rare, something neither of them named. Yet both understood, the world ahead would not be simple, it would not be free of judgment or expectation. But it would not be the same world they had left behind either, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, not by whispers, not by time, not by the quiet resistance of those who refused to see. Elena Whitmore did not need to speak again to prove what had already been revealed, and Duke Alexander Blackwood did not need to defend what he had already chosen to recognize. Together, without declaration, without promise, they stepped into the night. And though the path ahead remained unseen, it was no longer uncertain, because it no longer depended on anyone else to define it. And somewhere behind them, beyond the fading light and distant music, the court continued its endless cycle of judgment and illusion, unaware that the only thing it had truly lost that night was its power to decide who mattered and who did not, because some truths, once seen, can never be made invisible again, and some hearts only learn to beat again when held by the right presence.